The September 11th attacks in 2001 were quick to ignite America's global war on terrorism. The main goal of this new conflict was to locate and destroy the terrorists responsible for the 9/11 attack, with the US leadership soon determining that the very group they were looking for was residing in Afghanistan. Over the years, Afghanistan had witnessed the rise of the Taliban, an extremist militant movement that had taken over the country with the help of Al-Qaeda. In late 2001, the United States, aided by anti-Taliban tribe leaders, sought to overthrow the regime, with one of the biggest targets being the city of Kandahar. Welcome to Wars of the World. In the decades before 9/11, Afghanistan was ravaged by war and poverty. Though the country was economically poor, it wasn't until the late 1970s, following its invasion by the Soviet Union, that things changed drastically for the worse. Between 1979 and 1989, the Soviets occupied the country, despite being met with heavy resistance by the Afghan Mujahideen, Islamist militant groups who resented the invasion and were united by their belief that the country should be run based on Islamic teachings. These rebel forces were supplied with arms and even trained by the likes of Pakistan, the United States, the United Kingdom, Iran, and China. But despite their eventual win, the damage had been done. Afghanistan was left in disarray, destroying what little economic and political structures had once been in place. Adding to the turmoil was that the 9-year conflict had led to as many as 3 million civilian deaths and saw a further 3 million civilians wounded, as well as leaving over 5 million people without homes. Following the departure of the Soviets, Afghanistan's 5th president, Mohammad Najibullah Ahmadzai, remained in power but ultimately resigned in April 1992, not long after the Mujahideen rebel forces took over the city of Kabul, and he was murdered 4 years later in 1996. Over the next few years, Afghanistan was thrown into anarchy. The Soviet-Afghanistan War had introduced a culture of guns, drugs, and terrorism, and the former political structure of government and president was replaced by the Mujahideen, who were more like powerful militias. Though the Mujahideen had once been united, they were reported to be politically fragmented, which led to disagreements over what next steps should be taken. Civil war thrived in the 1990s, and eventually the Taliban emerged, seizing control of the country in 1996 and establishing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They subsequently implemented laws that followed strict interpretations of Islamic law, including forbidding women to access education and severing the limbs of people who carried out petty crimes. That same year, Osama bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan and established a base for Al-Qaeda. With their help, the Taliban took over the vast majority of the country, though pockets of resistance remained to the northeast of Kabul and in the northwest of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was thrown into the spotlight by Western media and by the United States government following the September 11th attacks. The 2001 assault saw the hijacking of 4 US jetliners that were then crashed into several prominent buildings, including the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. Al-Qaeda was soon found to be the terrorist organization responsible for the attack, while some of the 19 men involved had been trained in Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, in response to 9/11, US President George W. Bush announced that airstrikes against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan had begun, as part of the global war on terrorism. The official name for the Afghanistan war used by the US government was Operation Enduring Freedom, and its aims included destroying terrorist training camps and infrastructure within the country, apprehension of terrorist leaders, and putting a stop to all terrorist activities. Initially, the US had demanded that they be handed over Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders, including Taliban leader Mullah Mohammed Omar, but this demand was refused, and thus the United States government began to make their plans of retaliation. US leadership started plotting what steps it would need to take to initiate and successfully carry out a war against extremists in Afghanistan. But it wasn't without its difficulties. Afghanistan was a vast country, filled with mountains, deserts, and remote valleys, and establishing where and how to attack took some time, especially because they knew that the Soviets had been impeded by the difficult terrain and the weather conditions when they had invaded in the late 1970s. At the end of September 2001, a CIA team dubbed Jawbreaker arrived in the country and started working with anti-Taliban allies in order to establish a plan on how to overthrow the regime. The Northern Alliance became a useful ally to the US, as did the group of anti-Taliban Pashtuns residing in the southern part of the country. United States and British Special Forces soon provided equipment and training to their new Afghan allies, and the first attack on the Taliban was launched on October 7, 2001. During this assault, US Air Force bombers and US Navy attack bombers were sent to attack Taliban military and communications facilities, as well as what was believed to be several of their training camps. The city of Kandahar was also bombed during this operation, as it was home to numerous Taliban strongholds, as well as the residences of non-Afghans who were working with the regime. The US also hoped to strike Taliban leader Mullah Omar, though the overall aim of the bombardment was to neutralize the Taliban's air defense, something that the US leadership believed that they had achieved by the end of the assault. On October 19th, the area around Kandahar was raided during Operation Rhino, a joint Special Operations Command assault carried out by several Special Operations units, including the 75th Ranger Regiment. The goal of Operation Rhino was to secure an airfield which would later be dubbed Camp Rhino, located about 100 miles southwest of Kandahar, as seizing this area would allow the United States to support a separate air raid to be carried out on the nearby home of Mullah Omar. The airfield consisted of a 6,400-foot paved runway, which had been built on top of a dry lake bed. There was no running water and just a few buildings, as it had originally been intended as a hunting camp for the now President of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed. But intelligence around the time of the assault in 2001 suggested that it was likely not being used. General Tommy Franks of the United States Central Command later stated that another benefit of the operation would be that the United States could show the Taliban that it could carry out a surprise attack in the heartland of the regime's territory. It would also draw attention from the towns seized by the Northern Alliance. Before ground troops were deployed, several targets around the airfield were struck by US Air Forces, with reports claiming that around 11 Taliban fighters were killed, and several fled the area at the time. Following this, ground troops were dispatched, with one group of Rangers securing the area and establishing strategic defensive positions. Overall, the US teams were met with very little resistance, and no casualties occurred. The mission was wrapped up in less than 5.5 hours, and in the following days, a camp was set up around the airstrip and given to a US Marine unit. Video footage captured during this operation was distributed back in the United States as positive propaganda. Around this time, troops began trying to regain control of the regions in the north and northeast, after the leader of the Northern Alliance was assassinated by Al-Qaeda on September 9th. The US began looking for successors, eventually establishing generals Fahim Khan and Bismillah Khan as the new leaders of the Northern Alliance. Following the capture of Camp Rhino, US soldiers were able to get a good look at the stalemate that the Northern Alliance had been engaged in with the Taliban for years, long before the US had invaded. The Northern Alliance had control of an old Soviet airbase on the Shamalai Plains, which the Taliban could not get to due to minefields. But the burden of the situation was eased when the US called in airstrikes against the enemy. This barrage lasted several weeks, killing hundreds of Taliban fighters, disrupting their support, and significantly damaging their command. The Northern Alliance subsequently launched an attack on November 13th, which eventually led them to take Kabul within a single day without incident. The recapturing of the city forced the Taliban and Al-Qaeda members to move towards Kandahar in the south. Throughout the month of November, further posts were abandoned by the Taliban, who often opted to flee towards Kandahar. Attempts to take back the city of Mazar-e-Sharif from Taliban control also began on October 17th, though battle for the city did not occur until November. In the days leading up to it, Northern Alliance troops moved towards the city, severing phone lines, while on November 2nd, Green Berets, as well as several members of CIA's Team Bravo, arrived at the Dari Abalk Valley in order to support General Mohammed Atta Nur of the Northern Alliance and his men. Over the following days, several villages were seized from Taliban control. Shortly afterwards, the US began dropping propaganda into the city of Mazar-e-Sharif by way of leaflets and listing radio frequencies where civilians could listen to the US version of events. Special forces subsequently set up laser designators around the city, highlighting targets to be struck by guided munitions. On November 7th and 8th, in preparation for the Battle of Mazar-e-Sharif, American bombers struck Taliban defenders who had been grouped at Cheshma-e-Shafa at the south end of the city, and those at the Hajigak Pass. A former Taliban commander named Molvi Abdul Akhundzada would later record the grisly scene, quote, "When the bombing started, I was commanding some 400 fighters on the front lines near Mazar-e-Sharif. The bombs cut down our men like a reaper harvesting wheat. Bodies were dismembered. Dazed fighters were bleeding from the ears and nose from the bomb's concussions. We couldn't bury the dead. Our reinforcements died in their trenches." End quote. On November 9th, the fight for Mazar-e-Sharif finally began, kicking off when members of the CIA called in airstrikes against the Taliban at Tangi Pass, leading from Balk Valley to the city. In retaliation for the overhead bombardment, the Taliban launched rockets from a BM-21 Grad, a multiple rocket launcher left over from the Soviet invasion. Meanwhile, the Northern Alliance began their own attack, mounting horses or driving pickup trucks to do so. In the following hours, those same forces moved to capture both the city's main military base and its airport. Within the city, they met with light resistance, and because many of the control centers outside of the villages had been struck, the Taliban began to flee, moving towards Kunduz to recover and strategize. During the fight for the city, between 400 and 600 people died, although it's unclear how many were civilians and how many were the Taliban. Around 1,500 Taliban defected or were captured. Although Taliban forces were gone, the battle wasn't over, because hundreds of Pakistani volunteers had turned up at the city in the following days, rallied and recruited by Sufi Muhammad, a Sunni Islamist responsible for the creation of a militant group that sought to implement Sharia law in Pakistan. Many of the volunteers were teenage boys, and they wound up in the Sultan Razi Girls' School, which had been converted into a barracks. In the coming days, hundreds of the volunteers were killed, and although the Northern Alliance offered negotiations, they were repeatedly turned down. After the injuries of civilians and the murders of several peace envoys at the hands of the volunteers, members of the Northern Alliance started to return fire, and the ensuing gun battle rattled through the city for hours. Later, scribblings on the wall such as "Never Surrender" and "Die for Pakistan" were discovered. In the aftermath of the gunfight, US leadership approved the building for a bombing run. The ending of the battle for Mazar-e-Sharif was met with heavy criticism, however, with officials from the likes of the United Nations alleging that the Northern Alliance troops had massacred the volunteers when they attempted to surrender before the bombs were dropped. According to the claims, the volunteers became aware of the bombs and attempted to flee, but they were shot by Northern Alliance members, resulting in the deaths of 800 of the 900 volunteers. A later report by the Seattle Times observed that many of the boys who'd been recruited weren't primed for battle. They were simply farm boys, many of whom were illiterate and poor. Sufi Muhammad used loudspeakers attached to pickup trucks to air his message, encouraging the inexperienced and vulnerable to fight for their God, stating, quote, "Those who die fighting for God don't die. Those who go on jihad live forever in paradise." End quote. One man in the community believed that the boys were unsatisfied with life, which helped push them to volunteer. Northern Alliance leaders, for their part, offered up different explanations as to the fate of the hundreds of volunteers. One said all the boys died in the bombing. Another said some died of their wounds after surviving the explosions. One jailer alleged that a road accident had killed at least 43 of them. A young commander eventually revealed that some of the boys were being held as slaves, with another adding that as many as 1,500 boys had been taken over the months. But despite the controversy, little was done about the captured boys, with Red Cross workers, UN officers, and US soldiers all noting that it was a tricky situation as they did not want to alienate those that they worked with. Some of these boys were eventually released after their families paid ransom money. Nevertheless, the capture of the city was a success, with US Central Command noting that they did not think that control of Mazar-e-Sharif would be regained until the following year. Strategically, recapturing the city was a huge benefit to the US and its allies, as it allowed supply routes to open back up. The battle was considered the Taliban's first major defeat, and the girls' school was rebuilt following the recapture of the city. In the southern region, Kandahar became the next target of US leadership, who sought to reclaim the city that so many Taliban had fled to. Many military planners believed that this would be the hardest city to take, in part because it was miles from the Northern Alliance strongholds in the north of the country, but also because it was the Taliban's spiritual home, as well as its political center. There was some speculation that the capture of Kandahar may be delayed until the spring, as the US and United Kingdom had so few Afghan allies to work with in this area. But eventually, in early November, 2 Special Forces units made their way towards the city from opposite ends, gathering support on the way from their few available allies. One of the Special Forces teams began their journey close to the village of Tarinkot on November 14th. Here they met with Hamid Karzai, a tribal leader who would later serve as the 7th president of Afghanistan, and in 2001 had a small following of anti-Taliban troops, described as 35 well-meaning men, though this number would eventually grow to 800. Karzai sought to speak with the village elders and gather their support, but just 2 days into their stay at Tarinkot, the Taliban dispatched hundreds of men to take Karzai's life, viewing him as a threat to their power. Though Karzai sent out his own men to repel the advances of the Taliban troops, he relied heavily on US soldiers who far outnumbered his following. US planes were called in to bomb Taliban convoys, while on-ground troops, including Karzai's followers, successfully fought back against enemy forces, and the Taliban reportedly retreated after being caught off guard by the quick response of the US air support. In the following days, US troops began to equip and prepare Karzai's men as best as they could in the short time that they had. And on December 2nd, both the US and Karzai's troops moved south towards the village of Said Alim Kaleh, which contained a bridge that was deemed of critical importance. Adding to the pressure was the fact that Karzai had been notified that he would be serving as the head of the interim Afghan government, and thus special forces were determined to secure Kandahar and to get Karzai to safety. Though his men were able to dispatch the Taliban soldiers at the eastern end of the bridge itself was more heavily defended, and they were unable to break through. The US subsequently called on air support, but the Taliban remained in control of the bridge. Over the coming days, they would continue to push back against the enemy forces, hoping to drive the Taliban further and further back. On December 4th, the Afghan allies began to prepare for an all-out attack. Both Karzai's men and the US troops subsequently piled into trucks loaded with weapons, and airstrikes were called in to attack the ridge on the opposite side of the bridge. But the Taliban responded with sustained and heavy gunfire. Shortly afterwards, Karzai's men began to directly shoot at enemy forces, forcing them to move back. And though the Taliban sought to move forward on the bridge, repeated fire demanded that they move back once again and take cover. The US continued to call on airstrikes, and in the following hours, the Taliban began to realize that they simply could not advance, and so they started to retreat. They pulled back several kilometers, allowing Karzai's men to secure the bridge. The next day, however, the US was hit with a noticeable setback when a stray bomb landed in the middle of their own position, resulting in the deaths of 3 soldiers and leaving dozens more wounded. Another Special Forces team was brought in as a replacement, while the injured soldiers were tended to by medics. At this time, it was the most intense casualties the US had suffered and the worst friendly fire incident that they'd encountered. In the meantime, Karzai was busy making agreements with Taliban forces, who'd opted to surrender the city of Kandahar. The following day, December 6th, Afghan allies began moving into the area. The other Special Forces team, who were approaching from the south of the city, had been moving in a similar manner, entering through the Shin Narai Valley by the Pakistan border on November 18th, before meeting with anti-Taliban leader Gul Shahzai, who'd once been the governor of Kandahar. On the night of November 21st, Shahzai sent a small group of his men, led by his brother, to the city to negotiate the Taliban's surrender. But everything went downhill when they arrived, only to be met with gunfire. Though there were no casualties, Shahzai opted to change his route moving forward to avoid fighting before arriving at the city, so as not to drain the energy of his men or to use up their resources unnecessarily. They subsequently moved past the Taliban stronghold close by and entered the Afghanistan district. On the morning of November 22nd, his men, in a convoy of around 100 vehicles, journeyed towards the village of Taktepol in the Balkh province, meeting little resistance along the way. It wasn't until they reached a valley just east of Highway 4, around 3 miles from the village, that Shahzai attempted once more to reach a truce with the Taliban. Once again, the small force that he'd sent in was ambushed by the Taliban, who had no interest in surrendering, and US Special Forces called in air support to put a stop to the assault. Though Shahzai's men managed to withdraw, the Taliban began moving along Highway 4 and getting into firing positions using heavy machine guns and RPGs. US troops led the way in the ensuing battle, directing their allies and calling in further air support, leading to the Taliban's hasty retreat before abandoning the village altogether. On November 24th, the following morning, Shahzai's men entered the village. They split the highway in two between Kandahar and Charman, Pakistan, establishing checkpoints to the north and the south of the area. Over the next few days, US forces established an observation post overlooking the airport in Kandahar. They were able to see enemy forces and order airstrikes between the outlook and the facility, removing the Taliban from their path. The Taliban returned fire, sending artillery shells and rockets onto the outlook as well as the village. But the constant bombardment was too much, and it began to wear away at their determination. Some Taliban groups began to move north towards the town of Spin Boldak, where they took up defensive positions close to Shahzai's men. But they reportedly did not appear to be much of a threat, and they were even less so when a team of US Marines also took up a defensive position at the nearby Camp Rhino. By early December, the US and Shahzai's men were preparing to take the city of Kandahar. Though the Taliban swept through dry canals around the edges of Kandahar in an attempt to launch surprise attacks, their assaults were easily rebuffed, with Afghan allies managing to capture several enemy positions. The US and its allies began their attack on the airfield, expecting to take strong fire in return, but they were surprised to find no response from the Taliban. Shahzai was soon informed that the Taliban had left the city following the deal they'd struck with Karzai. Following this news, Shahzai, along with a small security group and some of the US team, moved into the city towards the home where he had once lived. The remaining troops joined them the following day, taking up residence in the governor's home, while Karzai reinstated Shahzai to his former position. Kandahar was officially secured on December 6th, with many enemy forces having been driven into Afghanistan's more rural areas, or across the border into Pakistan. The war in Afghanistan raged for another 2 decades, and Kandahar was the target of at least 2 other assault attempts during that time. The first of these attacks came on May 7, 2011, when the Taliban launched an offensive in an attempt to take back control of the city. The conflict is considered the biggest Taliban attack of the year, leading to over 40 deaths and causing at least 50 people to be injured. It also signaled to the US and those in Afghanistan who opposed the Taliban that the loss of Osama bin Laden days earlier had not deterred insurgent groups, and they were similarly unaffected by a loss of manpower over the previous 10 years. Early on the morning of May 7, 2011, members of the Taliban launched RPGs at the governor's office before carrying out further attacks on outposts, police buildings, and local offices. The vast majority of these offences utilised suicide bombers, but there were also armed foot soldiers assisting in the scheme. For 2 days, the Taliban wreaked havoc on the city of Kandahar, bombing buildings, injuring civilians and police, and killing other Afghans. Enemy forces received a lot of pushback, however, and they were eventually expelled from the city. Afghan police managed to corner over 20 militants in a hotel, where all but 2 were killed. The final 2, however, did not surrender. The police managed to shoot one, while the other, equipped with a suicide vest, took his own life. A Taliban spokesperson noted that the attacks were not, as theorized, in retaliation for the death of bin Laden. Instead, they were simply part of the Taliban's plans. The Third Battle of Kandahar came on July 9th, 2021, when the Taliban attempted yet again to regain control of the city. For weeks, a fight between the Afghan National Army and the Taliban ensued within the city, eventually wearing down many of the military members who fled to avoid being captured by the enemy. By this time, US troops were being withdrawn from the country, leaving many towns and cities vulnerable and with weak defenses, especially following onslaughts from the Taliban. Attempts to keep the Taliban from Kandahar were hampered by the presence of civilians who were sometimes caught in the crossfires, and eventually 11,000 families were forced to move into refugee camps. On August 5th, civilians were advised to evacuate the city. A lack of food, weapons, and ammunition contributed heavily to the erosion of Afghan defenses, and by August 15th, the Taliban had broken through the remaining defenses and Afghanistan's government had collapsed. The initial Battle of Kandahar was a huge success for the US and its allies, including Taliban-opposed Afghan leaders, and was a tremendous feat for the war on terrorism at the time. Analysts have given credit to thorough training and dedication in helping to collapse the Taliban just months into the US invasion of Afghanistan, while their firepower and allyships with other Afghans also played important roles. However, as we already know, it wasn't to last. In 2012, US and Afghan officials began building a plan for the US exit from the country. In May, they were able to put together a framework for economic and security cooperation between the two nations after NATO combat troops were to withdraw in 2014, with the US committing to lending Afghanistan's government military support in the following years. The agreement did not state whether or not the US and NATO soldiers would remain behind to help with training and advising, but a separate pact named the Bilateral Security Agreement would answer this question. However, it wasn't until late 2014 that this agreement was signed, when Ashraf Ghani was inaugurated as Afghanistan's new president in September. Though the US and NATO formally ended their combat mission in December of that year, around 13,000 soldiers remained behind, until in 2020 and 2021, when the troops were finally pulled out of the country. As mentioned previously, the 2021 Battle of Kandahar played an important role in the Taliban's resurgence. Without the backing of the US, Afghanistan fell once more under Taliban control, where it remains today. The overarching war in Afghanistan lasted 19 years and 10 months, and saw the deaths of as many as 212,000 people, including over 46,000 civilians. But it's the aftermath of the war that is somehow worse. The country is currently suffering what is considered one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time. Opposers of the Taliban are being unlawfully arrested and tortured, disappearing without a trace, and minorities are being heavily discriminated against. The rights of women and girls are being erased, and poverty is rampant. Many households are struggling to meet their basic needs, while natural disasters, the result of climate change, have ravaged the country and displaced hundreds of families. Food insecurity and famine are widespread, and things are only set to get worse. In 2022, UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths stated that issues including poverty and food insecurity have long been a sad reality in the country, but that since the Taliban takeover, the situation has become critical.